The statement was folded into thirds in Colin's laptop bag, tucked behind a stack of permit applications I'd asked him to drop at the county office that morning. I wasn't looking for anything. I was looking for a stapler. Ellison and Ashford Design Build didn't have a shortage of paper, but we had a permanent shortage of staplers because Colin lost them the way other people lose pens. The account name at the top read Meridian Site Consulting LLC. Not our firm, not any vendor I recognized from 6 years of running payroll, invoicing clients, and reconciling every account that touched our business. I unfolded it fully, expecting a mistake, expecting some subcontractor's paperwork that had gotten shuffled into the wrong bag by accident. The balance was $84,612. The account had been opened on April 3rd. Our wedding was April 24th. I stood in the kitchen holding a piece of paper with a number on it that made no sense next to a date I knew better than my own birthday, and I felt my hands go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the house being cold, because the house was not cold. It was June. I remember thinking distinctly that my hands should not feel like this in June. I read the account opening date 4 more times, not because I doubted what it said, because some part of me was waiting for the 5th read to say something different. It didn't. 3 weeks before he stood across from me and promised, in front of both our families, that there was nothing he wouldn't tell me, Colin had opened a bank account I didn't know existed, under a name that wasn't ours, and funded it with money that had come from somewhere I couldn't yet trace. I put the statement back exactly where I'd found it. Corners aligned, fold lines matched. Then I went back to looking for the stapler because Colin's key would be in the door in 11 minutes. And I needed my face to be doing something other than this by the time he walked in. I found the stapler. I don't remember where. What I remember is standing at the counter with my back to the door, listening to him come in whistling something from the radio, dropping his keys in the bowl the way he did every single day of our marriage, and understanding, with a clarity that arrived all at once instead of gradually, that the man walking toward me to kiss the top of my head had been someone else since before I married him, and I had no idea yet how far back that went. He asked what was for dinner. I told him chicken, the same as I'd planned that morning. He kissed the top of my head anyway, and I let him because I needed one more ordinary evening before I understood what I was actually looking at.
My name is Maren Ellison. I was 34 that summer, and I had spent the previous 9 years building a design build firm out of a card table in a rented duplex into a company with 11 employees and a waiting list. I do the design, Colin does the clients, the walkthroughs, the handshakes. The way he could make a nervous homeowner feel like their kitchen renovation was the most important project he'd ever taken on. We were good at different things, and for a long time, I believed that was the whole secret of us. I didn't marry Colin naively. I want to say that clearly because I know how this sounds from the outside, like a woman who ignored everything in front of her. I had dated men who lied about small things, men who needed managing, men whose stories didn't line up if you asked twice. Colin wasn't that. Colin double-checked invoices before I asked him to. Colin remembered which supplier had shorted us on tile 18 months earlier and brought it up unprompted when we placed a new order. I trusted him the way you trust someone who has, repeatedly, earned exactly that. We built the business together starting the year after we got engaged, both our names on the LLC, both our signatures on the loan that got us our first real office space. I did the books myself for the first 4 years until the volume got too big and we brought on a part-time bookkeeper. I still reconciled everything monthly. I was not a woman who didn't look. Here is the vulnerability I'll admit to because it matters later. I have a hard time believing something is wrong until I have proof so complete it can't be argued with. My younger sister used to tease me about it, that I'd rather sit with a bad feeling for 6 months than say something out loud I couldn't fully back up. It served me well in business. I did not yet know what it would cost me at home. We had a routine most people would have called boring and I would have called good. Sunday mornings at the kitchen table with the site plans spread out, a candle burning that smelled like cedar because Colin liked the smell of the lumberyard and brought a piece of it into every room he could. That table is where we designed our first 3 projects. It's where 3 weeks after I found the statement, I would sit across from him and finally understand what I was looking at. I tell you this not to convince you I was a fool, and not that I was unusually sharp-eyed. It matters that you understand how much of a real, well-built life was standing on top of the thing I was about to find. It wasn't a shaky marriage with obvious cracks. It was a good one, by every measure I had, until the measure changed.
Colin Ashford grew up in a house that stopped being his family's house when he was 12. His father ran a hardware store in the same small Ohio town for 16 years, the kind of place where people came in for a box of nails and stayed to talk for 20 minutes. It failed the way small businesses fail, slowly, then all at once, when a chain store opened 11 miles away and the bank called the loan due the same spring his father's health started going. I have told me the story maybe a dozen times over the years. Always the same details: the auction sign in the window, his mother crying in the truck in the parking lot, the 6 months they spent in his grandmother's basement before his dad found work again. He was 12. He watched his father's name get read out loud in a public foreclosure auction in a town where everyone knew that name. He has told me that he decided that year that he would never again let his life depend on money he couldn't see or touch or control himself. I believed him when he said it, because it explained so much of who he became. The man who read every contract twice, who kept 18 months of expenses in reserve for the business, who flinched physically at the word audit long before he had any reason to. I am not writing this to excuse what he did. I'm writing it because I think it's the only way to understand how a person you love builds a second secret architecture of protection without ever telling you he's still somewhere underneath the confident handshake and the good suits, 12 years old and watching his father lose everything. What I didn't understand yet was that Colin's solution to his oldest fear wasn't caution. It was a hidden exit. He wasn't protecting our business from collapse. He was quietly building himself a way out of one, funded with money that was never his alone to move. He was not a cartoon villain twirling a mustache over a spreadsheet. He was a frightened boy who grew into a capable man, and somewhere along the way, decided the people who loved him didn't need to know how frightened he still was or what he'd do about it. I think about his father sometimes, a man I only met a handful of times before he passed. Quiet at dinners in a way I understand differently now. I think about the version of Colin before any of this. The 12-year-old in a parking lot, watching strangers bid on shelving units his father built with his own hands. That boy didn't do anything wrong. It's the grown man who built on top of that wound, in secret, at my expense, who I hold responsible. The two things can be true without canceling out, and holding both at once was one of the harder parts of this year. Looking back, there were 6 moments I can point to now, spread across almost 5 years, each one small enough on its own that I explained it away without much effort. The first was the year we onboarded Priya as our part-time bookkeeper. Colin pushed hard for her specifically. A referral from a contractor friend, he said. Good rate, available immediately. I didn't think twice. We needed the help, and she was competent. The second was a client deposit that took 11 days to show up in our operating account instead of the usual 2 or 3. Colin said the bank had flagged it for review because of the amount. Banks do that. I let it go. The third was Colin asking to be the sole signer on a new business savings account we opened for equipment reserves. He framed it as taking something off my plate. I had plenty on my plate. I said yes. The fourth was a weekend trip to a supplier conference in Charlotte that ran 2 days longer than the schedule he'd shown me. He said the extra sessions got added last minute and he didn't want to miss the networking. I'd met plenty of his industry friends. It tracked. The fifth was money moving out of our reserve account in round numbers. $5,000, $8,000, labeled as contractor advance, with no contractor name attached. Colin said it was for a supplier who preferred cash-adjacent terms, a practice more common in our industry than people realize. I'd heard of stranger arrangements from other firm owners. The sixth was smaller than all of it, and somehow the one that sat with me longest. Priya stopped meeting my eyes in the office. Not dramatically, just a half-second delay before she'd say good morning, a habit of finding a reason to leave the room when Colin and I were both in it. I told myself she was shy. I told myself a lot of things that year. Each one alone had a door I could close it behind. Together, I wouldn't let myself look at them together, because looking at them together meant admitting I'd need to ask a question I wasn't ready to hear the answer to. I've gone back through those 5 years more times than I'd like to admit, trying to find the moment a reasonable person would have said something out loud. I don't think there was one clean moment. I think there were 6 small ones, each easy enough to explain away by itself, and a version of me who was good at her job precisely because she gave people the benefit of the doubt until the math refused to support it any longer. That instinct served the business well for a decade. At home, it just meant the math had a much longer runway before anyone made it show its work.
The pattern stopped being 6 separate doors and became one room in early spring, almost a year before I found the statement. On a Tuesday, I remember specifically because it was the day our biggest client of the year signed a $340,000 contract, and I should have felt nothing but relief. I was reconciling the equipment reserve account, the one Colin had asked to be sole signer on, because our accountant needed year-end numbers and Colin was traveling. The math didn't close, not by a little, by just over $19,000, unaccounted for across 4 withdrawals over 10 months, each one labeled contractor advance. None of them matching any invoice, payment record, or vendor name I could find anywhere in our system. I didn't confront him. I want to be honest about that. What I did instead was open a plain spreadsheet on my personal laptop, one Colin didn't use, and I started writing dates down. Nothing dramatic, a column for the date, a column for the amount, a column for what I'd been told versus what I could actually verify. I labeled it reserve notes because if anyone ever saw the file open on my screen, I wanted it to look exactly like the kind of boring administrative task it was pretending to be. Item 1 went into that spreadsheet that Tuesday. $19,000 across 4 withdrawals, no matching documentation. I told myself I was being responsible. Business owners keep records. I told myself this so many times that spring that I almost believed the spreadsheet was about the business and not about my husband. But I knew, even then, hell, I think I knew before I typed the first number, that I wasn't building a file for our accountant. I was building a file for myself, for a version of me a year or 2 down the line who might need to prove to somebody, maybe a lawyer, maybe just my own future self, that I hadn't imagined this, that I'd seen it in real time and written it down before I understood what it was. That's the moment the isolated incidents stopped being isolated, not because anything new happened that day, because I finally let myself hold 6 months of small things next to each other at once and looked at the shape they made. I kept the reserve notes file open in a folder buried 3 levels deep on my personal drive, backed up to a cloud account Colin didn't know the password to, updated it maybe once every few weeks after that Tuesday, always in the same flat administrative language. I never once wrote a sentence in that file that expressed how I felt. I think, looking back, that was its own kind of survival. If the file stayed boring, I could keep telling myself I was just being a careful business owner a little while longer. The statement in the laptop bag was the moment everything I'd been quietly logging stopped being a pattern I was managing and became a fact I couldn't manage at all. Once I had the account name,
Meridian Site Consulting LLC, I spent 4 days doing what I do best: methodical, patient work nobody sees. I pulled our reserve account history against the reserve notes file I'd kept for almost a year. I cross-referenced dates. I found the routing number on an old wire confirmation buried in a folder Colin thought I never opened, the one labeled MISC Admin, and matched it to Meridian. The account had been open for 6 years. Not 1, 6. Since 3 weeks before our wedding. The total that had passed through it, as far as I could trace using only what I had access to, was $214,000. I found this out on a Thursday afternoon, alone in the office after everyone had left, the cedar candle from the kitchen sitting unlit on the corner of my desk, because I'd brought it in that week for some reason I couldn't explain to myself. I sat completely still for a length of time I couldn't tell you, because I wasn't counting anything yet. I just sat. Then my body did something my mind hadn't caught up to. My hands went cold again, the same way they had in the kitchen weeks earlier, except this time it spread, up my forearms, into my chest, a specific hollow ache under my ribs that had nothing to do with breath. I put both palms flat on the desk because I needed to feel something solid. I didn't cry. I want to say that plainly because I think people expect the worst moment to look like tears, and mine didn't. Mine looked like silence and cold hands and a woman staring at a number on a screen, doing math she wished she'd never learned to do this well. What I decided, sitting there, was not to confront him that night. Not because I was afraid of him. Colin has never once raised a hand or a voice to me in 12 years. But because I understood with total clarity that the moment I said his name out loud with this information behind it, everything I still needed to find would disappear within the hour. Accounts close fast when someone knows they're being looked at. So I closed the laptop, blew out a candle I'd never lit, and drove home to make dinner like it was any other Thursday. I remember the drive specifically because I hit every red light on a route I usually timed perfectly without trying, and I remember being almost grateful for the extra minutes because I needed them to arrange my face into something that could survive a kitchen conversation about nothing. I decided that night, driving home with the radio off because I couldn't stand the sound of anything cheerful, that silence was going to cost me more than confrontation would have. And I chose it anyway because confrontation would have cost me the truth. Nobody tells you about performing normalcy, how much of your body it requires. Not just your face, though God, your face is the hardest part. Smiling at the right moments, asking about his day, letting him kiss the top of my head the way he always did, my whole skin wanting to flinch away from a gesture that used to mean something safe. It's your hands, too, passing him a plate without them shaking. It's your voice, keeping it in the same register you've always used, when every instinct in you wants to either scream or go completely silent. I lost 11 pounds over the 6 weeks that followed, without trying, without noticing until my sister mentioned my collarbone at a birthday dinner. I stopped sleeping through the night. I'd wake at 3, 4 in the morning, lie there next to him, listening to him breathe evenly, easily, like a man with nothing on his conscience. And I'd think, how does he do that? How does a person sleep like that? I told exactly one person during that stretch, my sister-in-law Renata, Colin's own sister, because I needed one human being on earth who knew what I was carrying so I wouldn't lose my mind carrying it silently. Renata didn't ask me if I was sure. She didn't ask what I had done to make him feel like he needed a secret account. She said, "Show me what you have." And when I did, she said, "I believe you," before she'd even finished reading. I didn't know yet how much I'd need to hold on to that sentence in the months ahead. The hardest part of the decision wasn't the fear of being wrong. I had a spreadsheet and a wire confirmation and an account that had existed for 6 years. I wasn't wrong.
The hardest part was the specific, ugly loneliness of loving someone every single day while quietly building the case that would end it. Nobody warns you that grief and investigation can occupy the same body at the same time. There were nights I sat on the closed lid of the bathtub after Colin fell asleep, not crying, just sitting, because it was the one room in the house where I didn't have to arrange my face into anything. I'd stay there 20 minutes, sometimes longer, and then I'd go back to bed and lie next to him like nothing had happened, because in his version of that night, nothing had. I didn't do anything reckless. I want that on the record, because everything that followed depended on doing this the boring, methodical way instead of the satisfying one. I started with our own books, which I had full legal access to as co-owner, and requested a full transaction history from our bank going back 7 years. A routine request any account holder can make, nothing that would raise a flag. That gave me the complete withdrawal trail behind item 1, the $19,000 I'd already logged. Then I hired an accountant Colin had never met, not our firm's accountant, a forensic one, recommended by a friend from a business owners group I belonged to that Colin had never bothered to attend. Her name was Denise. I told her I needed a professional reconciliation of our reserve account for internal purposes. She didn't need to know more than that yet, and I didn't offer it. Denise found item 2 within the first week, a pattern of contractor advances that all routed eventually through 2 intermediary accounts to Meridian. 6 years of them. Not constant, they clustered heavily around 3 specific stretches of time, which told her, and then told me, that something external was triggering the movement rather than steady skimming. I found what that trigger was myself, going back through our state contractor licensing correspondence. Twice in 6 years, our industry association had announced random escrow audits for firms above a certain revenue threshold. Once the year Meridian opened, once again 18 months ago. Both times, the reserve account activity spiked in the weeks before the audit window, then went quiet again once the audit cycle passed without our firm getting flagged. Colin wasn't reacting to opportunity, he was reacting to risk of exposure, moving money exactly when the odds of getting caught went up. That was item 3. 2 documented audit cycles, 2 matching spikes in withdrawals, 6 weeks apart from each announcement, both times. Denise called it too clean to be coincidence, in the same flat professional tone she used for everything, and something about hearing it said that plainly made it undeniable in a way my own spreadsheet, alone in my kitchen, hadn't quite managed to be. I had proof now. What I didn't have yet was the why, or how far back the intention really went. Denise didn't ask me a single personal question through any of it, which I was grateful for at the time and even more so later. She treated my marriage like a set of transactions that either reconciled or didn't, and there was something restful about that clean, unemotional framing while everything else had gone the opposite way. I paid her out of a personal account Colin never saw, small enough not to draw attention, because I understood by then that the same instincts that let him hide money for 6 years meant I needed to hide my own paper trail while I built mine. There is a version of this story where I tell you the investigation was the hard part. It wasn't. The hard part was a Tuesday. In the middle of it, 7 weeks in, when Colin came home early from a site visit because a client had canceled, and instead of going to change out of his work clothes, he sat down at the kitchen table where the site plans still lived, pulled me into his lap the way he'd done since we were dating, and said quietly into my hair, "I don't know what I'd do without you running this place with me. I mean that." I sat there in his arms, in the kitchen that smelled like cedar, with a forensic accountant's preliminary report sitting in an encrypted folder on a laptop 11 feet away, and I let him hold me.
I let myself feel for maybe 90 full seconds the same safety I'd felt in that kitchen for 9 years. It wasn't performance. That's the part I still haven't fully made peace with. The affection was real in that moment, on my side, and I believe on his. And it was happening in the exact same breath as a betrayal I had already documented in numbered, dated detail. I didn't sleep that night either. Not from anger, from the specific vertigo of loving someone accurately and inaccurately at the same time, in the same body, in the same hour. I told Renata about that Tuesday because I needed to say it out loud to someone who wouldn't tell me I was being dramatic or tell me I was being a fool for still feeling anything for him. She didn't do either. She said, "You're allowed to miss the version of him you thought you married while you build the case against the one you actually did." I wrote that sentence down. I still have it. What it cost me across those months wasn't just sleep or weight or peace. It was the specific, quiet loneliness of being the only person in a two-person marriage who knew what the marriage actually was. I was grieving him while he was still in the next room. I was mourning a version of my own life while continuing to live inside it every single day because I hadn't finished proving what I already knew. Some nights I'd catch myself laughing at something he said, genuinely, before I remembered, and the remembering felt like a small physical drop, like missing a stair in the dark. I don't know how to explain that to anyone who hasn't lived it, that the affection wasn't a lie I was telling myself. It was real, and it was also standing on ground I already knew was going to give out.
The reframe came from someone who had every reason not to talk to me at all. Derek Whitfield had been Colin's business partner for 3 years before Colin and I met. A commercial flooring company the two of them ran together in their late 20s before it dissolved in a way Colin had always described to me as creative differences. I found Derek's name in old incorporation records while I was tracing the earliest possible date Meridian structure could have been set up, and I called him on instinct more than strategy, expecting nothing. He remembered me. He'd heard about the wedding years back through mutual contacts. When I told him carefully, in general terms, that I'd found irregularities in a business account, he went quiet for what felt like a long time before he said, "Does the name Harbor Point Consulting mean anything to you?" It didn't. Not yet. But by the end of that call, it did. Harbor Point had been Colin's account, funded the same way during the last 18 months of his partnership with Derek. Money diverted from their flooring company's client deposits, structured to stay under reporting thresholds, closed within 2 weeks of Derek discovering it and forcing a buyout. Derek had never gone public with it. He'd taken his half of what remained and walked away quietly, because a lawsuit would have cost him more than it recovered. He didn't panic and build that account. He built it slow, over a year, the same way you'd build a house. I watched him do it once already. I'm sorry nobody warned you. Item 4 went into my file that night. A prior, structurally identical account at a prior business predating our marriage by years. This changed everything about what I understood I was dealing with. Meridian wasn't a mistake made under pressure, a one-time lapse from a man otherwise trustworthy. It was a system Colin had built, dismantled, and rebuilt at least once before, refined the second time with better timing, and a bookkeeper who knew how to keep it quiet. This wasn't a man who'd made one bad decision under stress. This was a man with a method. And I married him 3 weeks after he'd started running it again. I asked Derek before we hung up why he was telling me any of this now, years after he'd chosen to let it go quietly himself. He was quiet for a second, then said he'd always wondered if he should have warned whoever came after him, and that not doing it the first time had sat with him longer than he expected. I thanked him. I didn't tell him it had taken me 5 months of spreadsheets and a forensic accountant to get to the same door he'd walked me straight to in one phone call.
I didn't confront Colin to ask him why. I already had a why, and it wasn't dramatic and it didn't need his confirmation to be true. I understood it the moment I let Derek's call sit next to the story Colin had told me a dozen times about the hardware store, the auction sign, and the 6 months in his grandmother's basement. Colin wasn't building Meridian or Harbor Point before it to hurt anyone. He was building an exit that couldn't be taken away from him the way his father's store had been taken away. Not by a bank, not by a business partner, not even in the end by a wife. He needed a version of safety that existed entirely outside anyone else's reach, including mine. Because the 12-year-old in him had learned, in the most public way a child can learn something, that shared control is control you can lose. Understanding this didn't soften the damage. I want to be precise about that, because I think stories like this sometimes slide into forgiveness disguised as insight, and I'm not offering that. Knowing why a person built a wall doesn't make it hurt less to discover you were living on the wrong side of it. Colin's fear was real. My 6 years of trust were also real. Both things were true, and only one of them had been honest with me. What the full picture gave me wasn't peace. It was precision. I stopped asking myself in those last weeks before I'd confronted him whether I'd somehow caused this or missed some obvious sign I should have caught sooner. I hadn't caused a childhood bankruptcy that happened decades before we met, and I hadn't caused a man to decide twice now across 2 relationships that the people closest to him didn't deserve a say in his own safety net. Renata, when I told her what Derek had said, was quiet for a moment and then said something I've thought about often since. He's been protecting himself from losing everything since he was 12. He just never noticed he was the one taking it from us. I didn't correct her use of us. She'd already started building her own case, separately, about what her brother's pattern meant for her. I stopped, around then, expecting the full picture to feel like an ending. It didn't. It felt more like finally having the right map for a road I'd already been walking blind for months. The destination hadn't changed, but at least now I understood why every turn had felt the way it did. And I could stop wasting energy wondering if I'd misread the terrain or if I'd been the problem the whole time, which was a question I'd been quietly asking myself far more than I'd admitted, even to Renata.
I chose a Sunday morning at the kitchen table because that table had held every honest thing our marriage had ever produced, and I wanted it to hold this too. I brought one folder. Inside it, the 6-year account history for Meridian, the wire confirmation linking it to our reserve account, Denise's reconciliation showing the 2 audit cycle spikes, and a single page summarizing Derek's account of Harbor Point, dates matched against public incorporation records I'd since pulled myself. 4 items, numbered exactly as they'd gone into my file over 5 months. Colin had his own folder that morning, too, though he didn't know yet that mine existed. His was the quarterly projections he'd been preparing for a lender meeting. His life's evidence laid out in his own handwriting of a man planning a future he intended to keep having with me. He set it on the table across from mine before either of us said a word. Your list, my list. 2 folders, 6 inches apart, on the same table where we'd once designed our first house together. I opened mine and said one thing. Meridian Site Consulting was opened on April 3rd, 6 years ago. That's 3 weeks before our wedding. I didn't ask him to explain. I didn't ask him anything at all. I laid the 4 items on the table in order, said the total once, $214,000, as far as I can trace. And then I stood up, put my keys in my coat pocket, and walked to the front door before he had said a single word in response. The line behind me went quiet for exactly 7 seconds. I counted, the way I'd been counting everything for months by then, because counting was the only thing left that felt steady under my hands. Then I heard him say my name once, low, to a kitchen I was no longer standing in. I didn't turn around. Not because I wasn't afraid or angry, or somewhere underneath both of those, still sad in a way I hadn't fully let myself be yet. I didn't turn around because I had decided weeks earlier that the only power this moment could give me was refusing to stay for whatever came out of him next, reflexive and unexamined in the first 60 seconds after being caught. I sat in my car in the driveway for 4 minutes before I put it in reverse, hands steady on the wheel in a way that surprised me given everything else that had happened in the last 20 minutes. Then I backed out, drove to my sister's, and let myself finally shake somewhere between the second stoplight and the highway on-ramp, where nobody I loved could see it happen.
Colin called 4 times before I reached my sister's house that afternoon. I didn't answer any of them. He texted instead, and I read every message because I needed to know what strategy he'd land on once the shock wore off. The first messages weren't confession. They were context. Meridian was complicated. He'd meant to explain it eventually. The timing looked worse than it was. By the third text, the framing had shifted again. He was under enormous pressure after the flooring company collapse. He'd never fully processed what happened with Derek. He should have talked to someone. He saw now that he should have talked to me. Deflection, dressed carefully as vulnerability. Each message performing self-awareness without one's landing on an actual admission of what he'd done or why. He showed up at Renata's door that evening, which I hadn't expected and she hadn't invited. I watched from the hallway while she stood in the doorway and wouldn't let him past it. For about 4 seconds, something in his face changed. His shoulders dropped, his voice cracked on my name, and he said, "I don't know how to be the person who did this. I don't recognize him," in a tone I'd never once heard from him in 12 years. Raw in a way that didn't sound rehearsed. I believed that 4 seconds was real. I still do. Then Renata asked him one plain question. How much was in the account the day he opened it before a single client deposit ever touched it? And I watched the crack close over almost as fast as it had opened. His posture straightened. His voice found its familiar, reasonable register again. "That's not really the important number right now," he said. And just like that, the raw, unrecognizable man from 4 seconds earlier was gone, replaced by the version of Colin who always had the next sentence ready. Renata closed the door. Through it, I heard him say my name once more, quieter, to nobody. He never once, that day or in the weeks that followed, said the words, "I did this on purpose," twice, and hid it from you. He said sorry. He said complicated. He said pressure. He never said the one sentence that would have required him to stop protecting the exit and admit he'd built it with both hands, wide awake, over 6 years. I kept waiting for the version of this where he finally said it plainly, without a qualifier attached, and it never came. Not that week, not in mediation months later, not even once quietly when it was just the two of us, and there was nothing left to protect by admitting it. I think some part of me needed to stop waiting for that sentence before I could actually move forward, and letting go of the waiting turned out to matter more than the sentence itself ever would have. Winning, in the end, looked like paperwork, a forensic accounting report submitted to our business attorney, a buyout structured over 14 months so the firm itself could survive the split because 11 employees depended on paychecks that had nothing to do with what Colin and I owed each other. A dissolution of Meridian under legal pressure, with restitution scheduled into our settlement instead of pursued through a criminal complaint I chose, carefully, not to file, not for his sake, but because A public case would have taken years and taken the company down with it. And too many people who'd never touched that account depended on it staying open. Those are the practical costs, and I could recite them cleanly to anyone who asked. The other costs took longer to name. I lost the specific, uncomplicated version of trust I used to bring into every relationship, the kind that assumes good faith first and asks questions second. I don't have that anymore, not the way I used to. And I grieve it the way you'd grieve a physical ability you didn't realize you were using until it was gone. I catch myself still, rereading emails twice, double-checking numbers that don't need double-checking. Because my body learned a lesson my mind wishes it hadn't needed to learn. I lost 9 years of a specific Sunday morning at a kitchen table with a cedar candle burning, and I lost it in a way that means I can't smell cedar now without a small, involuntary flinch, which feels like an unfair tax on a smell I used to love for no reason connected to him at all. I lost, too, a piece of how I saw myself. The woman who believed thoroughness and love were the same instinct, who thought if she paid close enough attention, nothing could get past her. I paid close attention. It got past me anyway, for 6 years. And I'm still learning to hold that without turning it into proof that I should trust myself less going forward, rather than more. What I didn't lose? The company, which survived, my name, which is still on the door, and Renata, who chose in the weeks after that Sunday at Denise's office, reviewing settlement terms, to step back from her brother in a way that surprised even her. Not a full break, she told me, just enough distance to figure out who she was in this family now that she knew what he was capable of protecting. Some costs don't show up on any settlement sheet, and I've stopped expecting them to. I think that's the part nobody tells you going into something like this, that winning the concrete parts doesn't erase the softer bill underneath, and you pay that one slowly, in installments, for longer than anyone warns you it will take. My hands went cold twice in this story, once in the kitchen holding a folded statement, once at my office desk in front of an unlit candle. They haven't gone cold like that since the day I closed on the settlement, and I've started to think of that as its own small, quiet ending, even though nothing about that day involved fireworks or triumph. I signed papers, I drove home, I made dinner for one, in a kitchen I kept, at a table I refinished myself that winter, sanding down 6 years of pushpin holes from blueprints that used to matter to both of us. I still keep the cedar candle. I lit it again in October, alone, mostly just to see if I could, and I stood there in my own kitchen, waiting to flinch. I didn't. Not that time. It just smelled like cedar. I'm not gonna tell you that's a triumph either. It's smaller than that and truer than that. Some things you get back slowly, in pieces, without ceremony, on a random Tuesday when you least expect to notice you've gotten them back at all. Renata and I still talk every week. She's rebuilding something with Colin that looks nothing like what they had before. Careful, partial, unresolved, the kind of relationship where she watches for the patterns now, instead of assuming good faith by default. I don't know if it'll hold. Neither does she. That uncertainty is honest in a way I respect more than I would respect a tidy reconciliation. I kept the company. I hired a new bookkeeper myself, and I personally review every reserve transaction monthly, not because I don't trust the people around me, but because thoroughness was never the problem. It was where I chose to point it. Ellison Design Build has my name on the door now, just mine, and some mornings that still catches me off guard in a way I'm learning to let be a good thing. I didn't get the marriage I thought I built. What I got was proof that I could see clearly, act carefully, and still walk away with something worth keeping. My name, my work, my sister-in-law, and a kitchen table that only ever holds honest things now. There's a paperclip still in the top drawer of that table.
The same one that sat clipped to nothing in particular the day I found the statement, before it meant anything. I use it now to pin a sketch to the corkboard by the window, a bathroom layout for a client. Nothing sentimental. I noticed myself doing it last week and let myself feel for a second how strange and good it is that a paperclip can go back to being only a paperclip. Some things don't stay wounds forever. Some of them eventually get to be furniture again.